Hello! We are so excited to show you our native speech capabilities. Welcome back to the English journey. Today, we are exploring a vital topic that impacts everything you do, learning to love yourself more than anyone else. My name is Anna, and I am here to guide you through building the most important relationship of your life, the one with yourself.
And I am Abel. I'm so glad to be here with you, Anna. We often spend so much time trying to please others that we forget our own needs. Today we want to talk about how to use English to practice self-compassion and why loving yourself is not selfish, but essential.
That is exactly right, Abel. And I want to start by saying something that might surprise some of our listeners. For a long time, I believed that putting myself first was a bad thing. I was raised to believe that caring too much about yourself was the same as being arrogant or unkind. I thought that truly good people always prioritized others. But over the years, as I worked more deeply with students and people going through personal challenges, I realized that this belief was not only incorrect, it was actually harmful. When we do not love ourselves, we cannot give genuine love to anyone else. We give from a place of fear, obligation, or exhaustion, and that's not real giving. That's draining yourself until there's nothing left.
That really resonates with me, Anna. I used to be the kind of person who always said yes to everyone. A friend would call me at midnight with a problem, and I would stay up for hours, even though I had to wake up early the next morning. My boss would give me extra work, and I would take it all on even when my plate was already full. I thought this made me a good person, a reliable friend, a hard worker. But honestly, I was exhausted all the time. I felt resentful, and I didn't even understand why.
You've described something that so many people experience, Abel, and the word you just used, resentful, is a very important one. Resentment is often a sign that we are giving more than we can actually afford to give. It's a signal from deep inside us that says, I have been ignoring my own needs for too long. Now, here's the key distinction that I want our listeners to understand clearly. There's a very big difference between selfishness and self-love. Selfishness means taking from others without any care for how it affects them. It means prioritizing your wants, even when it causes real harm to the people around you. Self-love, on the other hand, means recognizing that you are also a person who deserves care, rest, respect, and joy. It means you fill your own cup first so that you have something real and genuine to offer to others. Think about the safety announcement on an airplane. They always tell you to put on your own oxygen mask before helping someone else. This is not selfish. This is survival. This is wisdom.
I love that analogy, Anna. The oxygen mask. It makes it so clear. You simply cannot help anyone if you aren't breathing yourself. So how do we actually begin to practice self-love? Because for so many of us, it feels uncomfortable. It feels almost foreign.
It does feel foreign, especially at first. And one of the biggest reasons it feels so uncomfortable is what I call the validation trap. This is the habit of looking outside of yourself to feel worthy. We wait for someone to tell us we did a good job. We post something on social media and then check obsessively to see how many people liked it. We make decisions based on what we think others will approve of, rather than what truly feels right for us. I did this for years. I remember one specific moment very clearly. I had written something I was genuinely proud of, a lesson plan, actually, and my first instinct was not to feel happy about it. My first instinct was to send it to 3 different colleagues to ask if they thought it was good enough. Only after they confirmed it was good did I allow myself to feel satisfied. And I thought to myself, why? Why could I not simply trust my own judgment? Why did I need their approval before I could feel okay about my own work?
That's such a relatable moment, Anna. I do the same thing with decisions in my personal life, even small ones, like choosing where to go for dinner or what kind of hobby to pick up. I constantly ask others what they think I should do, and sometimes their opinions are genuinely helpful, but a lot of the time, I already know what I want. I just don't trust myself enough to act on it.
Exactly. And this is the root of the validation trap. We've been trained by society, by school, by our families to measure our worth based on other people's opinions. From a very young age, we're praised when we follow the rules and criticized when we don't. So we learn to associate our value as a person with external feedback. The problem is that external feedback is inconsistent. People have bad days. They have their own insecurities. They project their own fears onto us. When we depend on others to tell us we're enough, we're essentially handing them control over how we feel about ourselves. And that's a very unstable place to live.
So, how do we begin to break out of that trap? How do we start generating that sense of worthiness from within?
It begins with a practice of self-acknowledgement. This means consciously taking time to recognize your own efforts and achievements, even when no one else notices them. At the end of each day, instead of reviewing what others said about you, you ask yourself three simple questions. First, what did I do today that I am proud of? It doesn't have to be something dramatic. Maybe you drank enough water. Maybe you were patient in a difficult conversation. Maybe you sat down and studied English for 20 minutes even though you were tired. Second, did I act in alignment with my values today? Not in a judgmental way, but just as a gentle check-in. And third, what did I need today? And did I give it to myself? These questions slowly begin to shift your attention inward. They train you to become your own source of validation.
I want to try that. 3 questions every evening. That's simple enough that it doesn't feel overwhelming. And I think the key is that you said not in a judgmental way. Because when I do try to reflect on my day, I often end up criticizing everything I did wrong.
That brings us to a topic that I feel very passionate about, Abel, and that is the internal dialogue, the voice inside your head. Psychologists sometimes call it the inner critic, and almost every human being has one. This inner critic is the voice that says, "You are not smart enough. You are not attractive enough. You made a mistake again. Why do you keep failing?" For many people, this voice is incredibly loud and incredibly unkind. And the devastating thing is that most of us would never speak to a close friend the way we speak to ourselves. If your best friend made a mistake at work, you wouldn't walk up to them and say, "Wow, you really are incompetent, aren't you?" You would say something like, "Hey, it's okay. Everyone makes mistakes. What can you do differently next time?" But we don't give that same gentleness to ourselves.
You're so right. And I've noticed that my inner critic is especially loud when I'm learning something new, like when I started learning English more seriously. Every time I made a grammar mistake or couldn't find the right word, this voice would say, "You sound ridiculous. People are judging you. You'll never be fluent." And honestly, that voice made me want to quit so many times.
And this is something I hear from language learners constantly. The inner critic is one of the biggest obstacles to fluency, not grammar rules, not vocabulary, the inner critic. Because when that voice gets loud, you stop taking risks, you stop speaking, you become afraid of being wrong, and therefore you stop growing. So one of the most powerful things you can do, both as a person and as a language learner, is to consciously transform your inner critic into what I like to call your inner friend. Your inner friend still sees when you make a mistake, but it responds the way a kind, wise friend would. It says, "That was a challenging sentence. Let's figure it out together." It says, "You tried something new today. That's brave." This transformation doesn't happen overnight. It's a practice, and one of the tools we can use to build this habit is positive affirmations.
I've heard about affirmations before, but I have to be honest, they've always felt a little strange to me, like standing in front of a mirror and saying, "I'm wonderful and beautiful and successful," just feels a bit awkward, and I'm not sure I believe it when I say it.
You are not alone in feeling that way, Abel, and I appreciate you being honest about it. The reason affirmations can feel hollow is that they are often too general and too distant from where you actually are emotionally. Saying, I am completely confident when you feel extremely anxious creates a psychological conflict that your brain immediately rejects. So instead of using big, sweeping statements, I recommend what some researchers call bridging affirmations. These are statements that are true and stretch you just slightly beyond where you currently are. So instead of saying, I am confident, you might say, I am learning to trust myself more every day. Instead of, I am fluent in English, you might say, every time I practice English, I am becoming a better communicator. These statements are honest. They acknowledge where you are while pointing you in the direction you are moving. And over time, as you repeat them, your internal narrative begins to shift in a real and measurable way.
That makes so much more sense to me. Bridging affirmations. I like that. They are honest, but they are also hopeful. And they do not ask you to pretend to be somewhere you are not.
Exactly. And paired with that shift in internal dialogue, we need to talk about something that is just as important, which is the practice of setting boundaries. Because no matter how much positive self-talk you practice, if you continue to allow people to overstep your limits, your sense of self-worth will keep eroding. Boundaries are not walls. They're not about keeping people out of your life. They're about defining what you are and are not available for. They're a declaration of how you expect to be treated, and setting them is one of the purest forms of self-love that exists.
Boundaries are something I have really struggled with, and I think a big part of it is the language. I never really knew how to say no in a way that felt kind but also firm. In my mind, saying no meant that I did not care about the person or that I was being difficult.
This is such a common belief, and it holds so many people back. Let us actually practice some English phrases for setting boundaries, because this is incredibly practical and useful for our listeners. When someone asks you to do something that you genuinely cannot or should not do, you can say, I appreciate you thinking of me, but I am not able to do that right now. Or, that does not work for me, but thank you for asking. Or if you need more time, let me think about it and get back to you. Notice what all of these phrases have in common. They're polite, they're clear, and they do not require a long explanation or an apology. You do not owe anyone a detailed justification for saying no. The reason is simply that it doesn't work for you. That's enough.
I love those phrases, especially that does not work for me. It's so calm and direct. It doesn't leave room for argument, but it's not aggressive either. I think I've been afraid that if I say no, people will be upset with me or think less of me. But maybe the people who truly respect me will respect my boundaries too.
You have just arrived at a very important insight, Abel. The people who respect you will respect your boundaries, and the people who react with anger or guilt when you set a boundary are often the very people from whom you most need to protect your energy. Boundaries actually reveal the quality of our relationships. When you start setting them clearly and calmly, you'll notice two things. Some relationships will become stronger, deeper, and more respectful, and others, the ones built on you constantly giving and never receiving, may fade. And while that can be painful, it's ultimately an act of healing.
That does sound painful, but I can also see how it would be freeing. When you are not spending all your energy maintaining relationships that take more than they give, you must have so much more energy left for yourself and for the connections that are genuinely nourishing.
Absolutely. And that brings us to one of my favorite aspects of self-love, which is self-care in practice. Now, I want to be very clear about something here, because I think self-care has been misrepresented in popular culture. It's often shown as bubble baths and expensive spa days and buying yourself gifts. And while those things are lovely when you can afford them and enjoy them, genuine self-care is much more fundamental than that. It's about consistently honoring your basic needs. It's about getting enough sleep instead of staying up until 2 in the morning scrolling through your phone. It's about eating food that actually nourishes your body instead of just grabbing whatever's fastest because you're too busy. It's about spending time doing something every day that brings you joy, not because it's productive, not because it will help your career, but simply because it makes you feel alive and like yourself.
Something that brings you joy simply because it makes you feel like yourself. I really like the way you said that. I think I lost a lot of hobbies over the years because I kept measuring them by whether they were useful. I used to love drawing when I was a teenager, and then at some point I stopped because I told myself it was a waste of time since I wasn't going to be an artist. But I genuinely loved it. I wasn't doing it to become anything. I was doing it because it felt good.
And that is exactly the kind of thing I am talking about. The things we do purely for the joy of doing them are deeply important for our mental and emotional health. They remind us that we have an identity beyond our productivity, beyond our usefulness to others. One practice that I recommend to almost everyone is journaling. Not journaling with a specific goal or structure, but simply writing freely every morning or evening. You write whatever is in your mind, your feelings, your worries, your small observations about the day. What this does is create a private space where you are completely honest with yourself. No audience, no judgment, no performance. Just you speaking truthfully to yourself on the page. And over time, journaling becomes a very intimate act of self-love because it says, my inner life matters. My thoughts and feelings deserve space and attention.
I have tried journaling before, but I always felt like I had to write something meaningful or well-written, like someone might read it, which is so strange because nobody else sees it.
That is a very telling habit, Abel. Even in our private journals, we sometimes perform for an imaginary audience. That is how deeply ingrained the need for external validation can be. The invitation is to give yourself permission to be completely unpolished, completely raw in your journal, to write in broken sentences, to repeat yourself, to write things that do not make sense, to write in a mixture of your native language and English if that feels natural. The journal is not a product, it is a process, and the process of regularly checking in with yourself in this way gradually builds a more honest and loving relationship with who you are.
Speaking of using English in a meaningful way, I want to ask you about something that you mentioned at the beginning, which is the connection between language learning and self-love, because I think so many of our listeners are learning English for practical reasons, for a job, for an exam, to move to another country, and those are all completely valid reasons. But can learning English also be an act of self-love?
This is one of the questions I love most, and I believe the answer is a profound yes. But let me explain the difference, because it is subtle and important. When you learn English purely for an external goal, to impress a boss, to pass an exam, to meet someone else's expectation of you, the motivation is coming from outside. And external motivation is often powerful in the short term, but it tends to be fragile. The moment the exam is over or the job is secured, the motivation can disappear completely. But when you learn English because you are genuinely curious, because you love the way stories sound in another language, because you want to connect with a wider world, because you believe in your own capacity to grow, that motivation comes from a completely different place. It comes from self-love. It comes from the belief that your inner life matters. Your thoughts and feelings deserve space and attention.
I have tried journaling before, but I always felt like I had to write something meaningful or well-written, like someone might read it, which is so strange because nobody else sees it.
That is a very telling habit, Abel. Even in our private journals, we sometimes perform for an imaginary audience. That is how deeply ingrained the need for external validation can be. The invitation is to give yourself permission to be completely unpolished, completely raw in your journal, to write in broken sentences, to repeat yourself, to write things that do not make sense, to write in a mixture of your native language and English if that feels natural. The journal is not a product, it is a process, and the process of regularly checking in with yourself in this way gradually builds a more honest and loving relationship with who you are.
Speaking of using English in a meaningful way, I want to ask you about something that you mentioned at the beginning, which is the connection between language learning and self-love, because I think so many of our listeners are learning English for practical reasons, for a job, for an exam, to move to another country, and those are all completely valid reasons. But can learning English also be an act of self-love?
This is one of the questions I love most, and I believe the answer is a profound yes. But let me explain the difference, because it is subtle and important. When you learn English purely for an external goal, to impress a boss, to pass an exam, to meet someone else's expectation of you, the motivation is coming from outside. And external motivation is often powerful in the short term, but it tends to be fragile. The moment the exam is over or the job is secured, the motivation can disappear completely. But when you learn English because you are genuinely curious, because you love the way stories sound in another language, because you want to connect with a wider world, because you believe in your own capacity to grow, that motivation comes from a completely different place. It comes from self-love. It comes from the belief that your inner life matters. Your thoughts and feelings deserve space and attention.
I have tried journaling before, but I always felt like I had to write something meaningful or well-written, like someone might read it, which is so strange because nobody else sees it.
That is a very telling habit, Abel. Even in our private journals, we sometimes perform for an imaginary audience. That is how deeply ingrained the need for external validation can be. The invitation is to give yourself permission to be completely unpolished, completely raw in your journal, to write in broken sentences, to repeat yourself, to write things that do not make sense, to write in a mixture of your native language and English if that feels natural. The journal is not a product, it is a process, and the process of regularly checking in with yourself in this way gradually builds a more honest and loving relationship with who you are.
Speaking of using English in a meaningful way, I want to ask you about something that you mentioned at the beginning, which is the connection between language learning and self-love, because I think so many of our listeners are learning English for practical reasons, for a job, for an exam, to move to another country, and those are all completely valid reasons. But can learning English also be an act of self-love?
This is one of the questions I love most, and I believe the answer is a profound yes. But let me explain the difference, because it is subtle and important. When you learn English purely for an external goal, to impress a boss, to pass an exam, to meet someone else's expectation of you, the motivation is coming from outside. And external motivation is often powerful in the short term, but it tends to be fragile. The moment the exam is over or the job is secured, the motivation can disappear completely. But when you learn English because you are genuinely curious, because you love the way stories sound in another language, because you want to connect with a wider world, because you believe in your own capacity to grow, that motivation comes from a completely different place. It comes from self-love. It comes from the belief that your inner life matters. Your thoughts and feelings deserve space and attention.
That really reframes the way I think about my own language learning journey. There have been times when I practiced English because I felt like I had to, like it was a requirement. And honestly, during those times, it felt heavy and stressful. But there have been other times, like right now honestly, having this conversation where it feels genuinely exciting, where I feel like I am discovering something about myself and about the world at the same time.
And can you feel the difference in your energy between those two experiences? That is the difference between motivation driven by fear or obligation and motivation driven by genuine love for yourself and your growth. And here's something beautiful that happens when you approach language learning from that place of self-love. You become a more successful learner. You are more willing to make mistakes because mistakes are just part of the process. And you are not learning to impress anyone. You are learning for yourself. You are more consistent because the practice itself feels rewarding, not just the outcome. You are more creative because you are not afraid of judgment, and you carry a kind of quiet confidence in your communication because you are not performing. You are simply expressing who you are.
I can feel that difference, Anna. And I want to ask you one more thing before we start to bring everything together. For someone who is listening to this right now and thinking, this all sounds wonderful, but I genuinely do not know how to start loving myself. It feels too far away from where I am. What would you say to that person?
I would say, first, that the fact that you are listening to this conversation at all means that something inside you is already moving in this direction. You do not find a conversation like this by accident. Some part of you is reaching for something better, and that impulse is itself an act of self-love. And second, I would say that you do not have to start big. You do not have to completely transform your self-image overnight. You simply have to start small and start today. Tonight, ask yourself those 3 gentle questions at the end of the day. Tomorrow morning, replace one self-critical thought with a bridging affirmation. This week, say no to one thing that does not truly serve you and notice how that feels. Spend 20 minutes doing something you love for no reason other than that you love it. Write 3 sentences in your journal, or in English if you want to practice, about how you are feeling right now. These tiny acts accumulate. They build a foundation, one small layer at a time, until one day you realize that you actually trust yourself, that you actually enjoy your own company, that you make decisions from a place of inner clarity rather than external anxiety. That transformation does not arrive in a single dramatic moment. It arrives in the quiet repetition of choosing yourself again and again, in the small and ordinary moments of your daily life.
That is such a compassionate and practical answer, Anna. And I think
The key message I am taking away from everything we have talked about today is that self-love is not a destination you arrive at and then you're done. It is an ongoing practice. It is the relationship you have with yourself every single day, through the inner dialogue you choose, through the boundaries you set, through the care you give yourself, through the things you pursue for the pure joy of growing.
You have summarized it beautifully, Abel, and I want to leave our listeners with this thought. The way you love yourself sets the standard for everything else in your life. It determines the relationships you accept, the opportunities you pursue, the voice you use when you speak in any language, and the way you carry yourself through a world that will always have opinions about who you should be. When you root yourself in genuine self-love, none of those outside opinions can move you from your center. You become someone who speaks with authenticity, who listens with presence, and who gives from a place of genuine fullness rather than quiet depletion.
And for every person listening to us today in English, whether this is your first time practicing or you have been on this journey for years, remember that choosing to learn, to grow, and to show up for yourself in this way is one of the most loving things you can possibly do. And you are already doing it right now.